They were an ordinary couple, just looking for a weekend escape in the Washington mountains. But when their car was found abandoned, their campsite empty, and a machine built for grinding was discovered deep in the forest, the story turned into something far darker. For 4 years, their disappearance haunted an entire community. And when the truth finally surfaced, it was more disturbing than anyone could imagine. On the morning of July 7, 1985, the quiet town of Mount Vernon, Washington, stirred awake under the kind of summer sky that felt endless. The weather was warm, the skies were clear, and the North Cascades stretched out like a green cathedral, luring campers and hikers into its vast wilderness. For Steven and Patricia Thompson, a married couple in their early 40s, it was supposed to be nothing more than a weekend getaway, just a casual overnight camping trip, a small escape from the grind of everyday life. They were not reckless adventurers, nor thrill-seekers chasing danger. They were, by all accounts, grounded, ordinary people. Steven worked as an insurance agent. He was steady, dependable, known for his meticulous nature. Patricia, a part-time librarian, was thoughtful and warm, the kind of woman who never missed sending a birthday card. They had built a life around their small circle of family and friends, their modest home, and the ordinary rhythm of work weeks and weekends. Camping in the North Cascades was something they did from time to time, never venturing far off marked trails, always returning by the following day. It was their way of reconnecting with each other. No phones, no noise, no obligations. Just the forest, the stars, and the sound of running water in the distance. No one who knew them could have guessed that this trip would be their last. Their son, Tyran, was 19 at the time, a college student home for the summer. He remembered that morning clearly. His parents had been in good spirits, gathering their modest gear, sleeping bags, a cooler, a small tent. Patricia hummed softly as she packed sandwiches, while Steven double-checked the car's tires and fuel. Before leaving, Patricia kissed her son on the cheek. "We'll be back tomorrow morning," she promised. "Don't forget to feed Daisy." Daisy was their dog, a loyal mutt with a gentle temperament. That was the last moment Tyran would ever see his parents alive. By Sunday morning, when the couple didn't return, Tyran wasn't immediately alarmed. Maybe they'd stayed a little longer to enjoy the mountain air. But as noon passed, then the evening, his unease grew into gnawing dread. His parents weren't careless people. They were predictable, reliable. If they said they'd be home, they'd be home. By late afternoon, Tyran drove out toward the Cascades himself, hoping he might spot their car along the highway. He didn't. By evening, he contacted local authorities. The Skagit County Sheriff's Office logged it as a missing persons case, though at first, there was no sense of urgency. Adults sometimes chose to get away for a while, but Tyran insisted this was different. His parents would never disappear without word. The following day, searchers located the couple's green Subaru wagon, abandoned near a trailhead deep within the North Cascades. At first glance, there was nothing unusual. The vehicle was locked, parked neatly, as though Steven and Patricia had simply gone on a short hike. But the longer authorities examined the scene, the stranger it became. Inside the car, their cooler half full, Patricia's handbag still containing her wallet, a small stack of library books on the back seat. Even their tent and sleeping bags were still packed. If they had planned to spend the night, they hadn't taken the gear with them. It was as if they had parked the car, stepped out for a moment, and evaporated into the trees. Authorities quickly organized search parties. Volunteers, dogs, and helicopters scoured the nearby trails. The area was rugged but not impenetrable, a place frequented by hikers every weekend. For 3 days, searchers combed the region. They found no clothing, no footprints, no campsite, no broken branches indicating a struggle. Nothing. The North Cascades wilderness was vast, nearly 700,000 acres of alpine peaks and glacial valleys. People got lost, sometimes fatally. But Steven and Patricia were not inexperienced. And there was something deeply unsettling about the lack of any trace. No tracks leading away, no signs of disorientation. The sheriff's office began to consider darker possibilities. In the small community of Mount Vernon, theories swirled. Some whispered that maybe the couple had planned to vanish, to start over somewhere far away. But those who knew them dismissed the idea immediately. They were deeply rooted: family, home, careers, responsibilities. Others speculated about an accident, a fall, a river crossing gone wrong. But again, no evidence, no bodies, no gear, not even a shoe. And then there was the possibility no one wanted to say aloud: that Steven and Patricia had met with foul play. Back at home, Tyran clung to hope in those first days. He told himself the searchers would find them, that maybe they were injured, maybe waiting somewhere for help. But each day that passed without a clue chipped away at that hope. The house grew unbearably silent. Daisy whined at the door, waiting for her owners. Mail piled up on the counter. Friends came by with food, trying to comfort the young man, but their faces carried the same grim doubt. On the fourth night, unable to bear it, Tyran drove back to the trailhead himself. He sat in his parents' locked car, inhaling the faint scent of his mother's perfume clinging to the upholstery. He stared at the empty passenger seat and whispered, "Where are you?" There was no answer, only the heavy silence of the mountains pressing in from every side. Authorities dug deeper. They checked the couple's finances, phone records, recent behavior. Nothing was unusual. No large withdrawals, no hidden debts, no signs of strain in their marriage. By all accounts, they had simply gone camping and never returned. Detectives questioned hikers and campers who had been in the area that weekend. Some remembered seeing the Subaru. A few thought they might have spotted a couple matching Steven and Patricia's description walking a trail, but the accounts were vague, inconsistent. Nothing solid emerged. One deputy later recalled an odd detail. Near the trailhead, about 200 yards from the car, they found an empty orange backpack lying against a log. It wasn't new, worn at the edges. It contained nothing identifiable. At first, investigators thought it might belong to the couple. But when shown to Tyran, he shook his head. That's not theirs. The backpack was collected as evidence, but no fingerprints, no leads came from it. Just another loose end in a case already defined by absence. Weeks turned into months. Despite extensive search efforts, not a single piece of physical evidence surfaced. No bodies, no gear, no confirmed sightings. The couple had simply vanished. For the Thompson family, life became a blur of waiting and unanswered questions. Birthdays passed, holidays came and went, and always the empty chairs at the dinner table. Tyran dropped out of college for a time, unable to focus, consumed by the absence of answers. He drove back to the Cascades often, walking the trails alone, staring into the endless trees, convinced the forest was hiding his parents' fate. The investigation slowed. Detectives moved on to newer cases. And soon, the disappearance of Steven and Patricia faded from the headlines, relegated to a tragic mystery without resolution. If you're drawn into mysteries like this, don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's go back to the night it all began. What no one knew then, what no one could possibly imagine, was that 4 years later, the wilderness would give up a grim secret. A discovery so disturbing, so unexplainable, it would reopen the case, reignite the grief, and deepen the mystery even further. Because hidden among the trees, waiting for time to reveal it, lay the first real clue of what had happened to Steven and Patricia Thompson. The first weeks after Steven and Patricia's disappearance passed in a haze. At first, the family clung to hope. Missing persons cases, after all, sometimes ended in miracles. People turned up dazed but alive, stranded but rescued. Tyran, young and desperate, replayed those possibilities in his mind like a mantra. They're out there. They just need to be found. But the days stretched into weeks, and no miracle arrived. 19-year-old Tyran carried a weight no young man should ever have to bear. Overnight, he had gone from carefree student to next of kin, the sole point of contact for investigators, reporters, and family friends. The first time he walked into the sheriff's office to sign paperwork, he noticed how the detectives avoided his eyes. They had seen this before. Disappearances that began with urgency, hope, and manpower, and ended in silence. At night, the house was unbearable. Daisy, the family dog, paced the hallway, pausing often at the front door as if waiting for familiar footsteps. Tyran would sit on the couch, staring at his mother's knitting basket, at his father's half-read newspaper. The ordinariness of it all was a kind of cruelty. Everything was in its place except them. Mount Vernon was not a city used to mystery. Neighbors whispered at grocery stores and church gatherings. Flyers with the couple's photos appeared on telephone poles. Steven's tidy haircut, Patricia's soft smile. Their names became synonymous with fear. Some said the forest had swallowed them whole. Others wondered if a predator, a bear, a cougar, had taken them. The more conspiratorial whispered about criminals lurking in the mountains, or even cult activity. Each theory made its way back to Tyran, and each one left him raw. He didn't want rumors. He wanted answers. The sheriff's office did what it could. Deputies interviewed campers and hikers again. They checked for stolen cars in nearby counties. They spoke to the Forest Service, asking if anyone had noticed suspicious campsites. Nothing. The orange backpack found near the Subaru yielded no leads. The FBI briefly consulted, but without evidence of abduction or foul play, jurisdiction remained local. Months passed. Funding for searches dwindled. Helicopters no longer flew overhead. Volunteer turnout shrank. Detectives began to tell Tyran gently what he already feared. Without new evidence, there was little more they could do. The case was drifting toward what law enforcement called inactive, what families called forgotten. Holidays became unbearable reminders. Thanksgiving came, and Tyran set 2 extra places at the table out of habit. He couldn't bring himself to put them away. On Christmas Eve, he found himself sitting on the living room floor, staring at the ornaments his mother had carefully packed the year before. He couldn't decorate without her. He boxed them up again, sealing away not just decorations, but the warmth of his childhood. Birthdays passed with no calls, no cards. Each date circled on the calendar was a wound reopened. Relatives offered to take Tyran in, but he refused. The house felt like the last link to his parents. Leaving it felt like surrender. Not everyone believed the couple had simply vanished into nature. Some locals pointed to the way the car had been left. Parked neatly, locked, valuables still inside. If they had been attacked on the trail, why was the car untouched? A retired officer speculated to a local paper. It looks more like they were lured away than lost. Others whispered darker suspicions. Murder-suicide, secret debts, a double life. To those who knew Steven and Patricia, the theories were cruel, baseless. But once a mystery settles into silence, speculation thrives. For Tyran, every new rumor was another twist of the knife. He knew his parents. They hadn't run away. They hadn't staged anything. Something had happened in those woods. Something deliberate. By the second year, Tyran had abandoned his college plans. He worked odd jobs in town, just enough to keep the house running. Friends drifted away. Their lives moved forward while his remained frozen in July of 1985. He began to spend long hours in the local library, poring over maps of the Cascades. He read survival guides, case studies of other disappearances. He studied predator patterns, terrain accidents, even obscure true crime files. He was searching for anything, any scenario that could explain why 2 ordinary people could vanish so completely. But every path led back to the same empty place. No answers, no bodies, no peace. By the 3rd year, the Thompson case was no longer front-page news. It had become something else, an unsettling local ghost story. Parents warned their children not to wander far into the mountains. Remember the couple who disappeared? Hikers spoke of uneasy feelings on certain trails, of the abandoned Subaru, now long towed away but remembered like an omen. The wilderness itself seemed complicit, a vast accomplice that had swallowed the truth whole. For Tyran, the ghost story was personal. Every time someone told it with a shake of the head, he wanted to scream. They weren't just a story. They were my parents. By the 4th year, the investigation was a folder collecting dust in the sheriff's office. Detectives moved on. New deputies barely recognized the name. The case of Steven and Patricia was officially inactive. For Tyran, it felt like a betrayal. How could the world keep spinning while his parents were simply gone? The silence was worse than grief. Grief had rituals, funerals, graves, closure. Silence was endless, shapeless, unbearable. On a gray October morning in 1989, nearly 4 years to the day after Steven and Patricia drove into the North Cascades, a logging crew working deep in the forest stumbled across something unusual. At first, they thought it was ordinary debris, rusting metal, half buried in soil. But as they looked closer, realization set in. It was a machine that had no business being out there, miles from the nearest road. A wood chipper. And what it contained would drag the Thompson case back into the light in the most disturbing way imaginable. It was October 1989. For years since Steven and Patricia Thompson had driven into the Cascades and never returned. For most of Mount Vernon, their names were now echoes, whispered reminders of a mystery gone stale. But that morning, when a crew of loggers pushed deeper into a rarely touched stretch of forest, fate intervened. They were cutting a new service road, chainsaws snarling against the quiet, when one of the men spotted something unusual through the trees. Rusted metal, large, half swallowed by moss and soil. At first glance, it looked like abandoned logging equipment, nothing out of the ordinary in these parts. But as the men cleared brush, unease rippled through them. It wasn't just any equipment. It was a wood chipper, and it wasn't supposed to be there. The chipper was battered, its paint flaking, but unmistakable. A heavy-duty industrial model, the kind contractors used, not casual homeowners. It was lodged in an unnatural position, like someone had tried to drag it off the road and conceal it in the brush. The loggers circled it warily. Out here, miles from the nearest main trail, the machine felt sinister, like a piece of violence left behind. One man leaned in, frowning at the chute. He reached for a stick, poked inside. Something clumped and brittle spilled out, falling into the pine needles. At first, he thought it was just mulch, but as he crouched lower, his stomach tightened. It wasn't mulch. It was bone fragments. Within hours, deputies from the Skagit County Sheriff's Office arrived, their radios crackling in the misty air. Crime scene tape was strung across the trees. Investigators stood in stunned silence at the sight of the abandoned machine. Carefully, they began to extract what the loggers had seen. Tiny shards of bone, bits of hair, scraps of fabric twisted in the rusted teeth. The realization came slowly, then hit like a tidal wave. This wasn't just abandoned equipment. It was a crime scene. Forensics teams worked methodically. The chipper was hauled out of the forest, its insides bagged and cataloged. Under microscopes, technicians confirmed the fragments. Human bone, shattered and pulverized. The press caught wind quickly. Headlines erupted. Wood chipper found in Cascades, human remains inside. For the Thompson family, the news landed like lightning. Tyran remembered staring at the television, frozen, as the anchor repeated the words over and over. Bone fragments, human remains. For years of silence, and suddenly, this. But the question was immediate, unbearable. Were they his parents? In 1989, forensic science was advancing, but slowly. DNA testing was in its infancy, just beginning to appear in criminal trials. Analysts relied heavily on dental records, skeletal comparison, and trace material. The fragments from the wood chipper were small, most less than an inch. But one piece, a partial jawbone, contained intact teeth. Dental charts were pulled. Records were requested. And after careful comparison, the confirmation came. The jawbone matched Steven Thompson. Forensic experts would later testify that the bone was consistent beyond doubt. But only Steven's remains were positively identified. No definitive evidence of Patricia was found among the fragments. The discovery brought both closure and a new, chilling mystery. Had Patricia met the same fate? Or was her absence from the evidence a sign of something different? For Tyran, the confirmation was devastating. His father was gone, murdered, shredded by a machine meant for trees, not people. And his mother? Still missing, still unaccounted for. The duality was unbearable. An answer on one side, a yawning silence on the other. The discovery reignited the investigation with a ferocity not seen in years. Detectives returned to the 1985 disappearance file, re-examining every note, every interview. Theories shifted instantly. No longer was this about hikers lost in the wilderness. This was homicide, planned, deliberate, and horrifyingly calculated. Who had hauled a wood chipper into the Cascades? Who had the strength, the motive, the coldness to do something like this? The orange backpack, once dismissed, was brought out of evidence again. Photos of the scene were re-examined. Witnesses from 4 years ago were re-interviewed. But leads were thin. Too much time had passed. The trail was cold. For the community, the discovery was a shockwave. The ghost story of the missing couple had transformed into something darker. Something real. The word spread quickly, wood chipper. People said it in hushed tones, shaking their heads, unable to comprehend the cruelty. Parents pulled their children close. Hikers stayed off the trails. And for Tyran, the weight was crushing. He couldn't escape the mental image. His father, a steady, gentle man, reduced to fragments by a machine in the woods. He couldn't stop asking the same question. Why? With the new evidence came new speculation. Some theorized robbery, that the couple had stumbled upon someone hiding equipment or supplies and paid the price. Others whispered about drug traffickers using the mountains for cover. The late 80s had seen an uptick in such activity across Washington. A darker theory suggested the killer had chosen the woods deliberately, the chipper as a means of erasing bodies in a place no one would ever look. Each theory added fuel to the fire, but none came with proof. Investigators also couldn't ignore an unsettling parallel. Just 3 years earlier, in 1986, the infamous wood chipper murder in Connecticut had made national headlines. A man named Richard Crafts had killed his wife and fed her remains through a chipper. The case was grotesque, unforgettable. Had someone in Washington mimicked that crime? Or was it coincidence? A sickening convergence of brutality? The timing gnawed at detectives. The sheriff's office announced officially, the Thompson disappearance was now a homicide investigation. But reopening the case didn't mean solving it. There were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no clear suspects. Just the rusted remains of a machine that had sat for years, silently holding its secret. For Tyran, the announcement was bitter. He wanted answers, not headlines. He wanted names, justice, closure. Instead, he found himself reliving the wound of 1985, except now it was sharper, darker, filled with images too horrific to bear. The discovery that should have clarified things only made the story murkier. Steven was confirmed dead. Patricia was still missing. The car had been parked neatly, untouched. Their belongings left behind. And now, a machine no one could explain, abandoned in the depths of the forest. It was as if someone had constructed the perfect riddle, then walked away, daring the world to solve it. And for investigators, for family, for everyone touched by the case, the riddle was only just beginning. This case remained unsolved for years. And if you're following this journey with us, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next changes everything. The discovery of the wood chipper had torn the Thompson case open again. For 4 years, the couple's names had been slipping into silence. Now they were headlines once more. But the problem was immediate, frustrating, and cruel. There were no suspects. Detectives pulled the old 1985 files from storage. Dusty folders filled with interviews, search maps, timelines. They pinned photos of Steven and Patricia to a corkboard once again. But so much time had passed. Witnesses had moved. Memories had faded. Leads that might have been alive in 1985 were now nothing but ghosts. The chipper itself yielded little. Serial numbers had been filed off. Its parts were rusted, degraded by years in the forest. Investigators tried tracing its make and model, contacting equipment suppliers across Washington, but the trail ended in dead ends. It was as if the killer had known exactly how to erase their tracks. Without hard evidence, theories multiplied. Robbery gone wrong. Some detectives believed the couple had stumbled on something they weren't supposed to see. Illegal logging, smuggling, even drug activity hidden in the mountains. But why then was their car untouched? Why were their belongings left behind? Targeted attack. Others wondered if the couple had been deliberately hunted. Someone with a grudge, someone who wanted not just to kill, but to erase. The wood chipper, they argued, spoke of rage. Patricia's absence. The most disturbing theory centered on Patricia. If Steven's remains were found, why not hers? Did she escape? Was she taken? Or was she the intended target all along? Each theory left more questions than answers. As weeks turned into months, investigators tried to narrow down possible suspects. They looked at acquaintances, former co-workers of Steven, friends of Patricia, even distant relatives. But no one fit. No one had motive. Detectives canvassed the logging industry, asking if anyone remembered a missing wood chipper. But in a region where equipment was borrowed, abandoned, or stolen regularly, it was like searching for a shadow. One man briefly came under suspicion. A drifter who had camped near the area in 1985. He had a violent past, a temper, and a criminal record. But when pressed, nothing linked him to the chipper. He was released. False suspect after false suspect passed through the system, each one raising hope for an answer, each one ending in disappointment. For Tyran, each development was another reopening of the wound. Detectives called him when new leads surfaced, only to call again weeks later with silence. He stopped answering the phone some days, unable to endure the cycle of hope and collapse. By the 5th year, the pressure was visible. Friends described him as haunted, withdrawn. He spoke less, smiled less. He worked long hours, then sat at the kitchen table late into the night, staring at the empty chairs where his parents used to sit. He told a cousin once, quietly, "I can't bury them. Not really. Not until I know why." Mount Vernon, once a quiet town that prided itself on safety, lived with an undercurrent of unease. Parents warned children not to wander into the woods. Stories of the chipper in the forest spread, warped into legend. Some said you could still hear the machine at night, running in the distance. Others claimed the woods themselves were cursed. The town's trust in law enforcement faltered. How could people vanish so completely? How could killers walk free? By 1991, 2 years after the discovery, the investigation had stalled once more. Leads had dried up. Detectives rotated out, reassigned to other cases. The Thompson file was still technically active, but like so many cold cases, it drifted lower on the priority list. To Tyran, it was a betrayal he knew too well. The pattern was repeating. Urgency fading, silence returning. He refused to accept it. Unable to watch his parents' case fade again, Tyran began to investigate on his own. He wrote letters to journalists, begging them to revisit the story. He collected old news clippings, highlighted inconsistencies. He reached out to private investigators, offering money he didn't have. On weekends, he drove into the Cascades himself. He walked trails alone, searching for anything. Scraps of fabric, bones, clues left in the soil. He returned to the spot where the car had been found, to the place where the chipper had been discovered, as if standing there might give him answers. But the forest gave him nothing, just silence. Always silence. Years passed. Steven's partial remains were buried in a small cemetery, but Patricia's grave remained empty. Tyran stood there often, torn between two halves of grief. The part that could bury his father, and the part that could never bury his mother. He told a local paper once, "It's like they're both gone, but only half of the truth is here, and half the truth is no truth at all." By the mid-1990s, the Thompson disappearance and the wood chipper discovery had taken on a life of their own. True crime enthusiasts swapped theories. Journalists revisited the case on anniversaries. The phrase "Washington wood chipper mystery" became a shorthand for the unsolved and the grotesque. But for Tyran, it wasn't a mystery. It was his life, his loss, his unanswered wound. The case lingered in limbo, too brutal to forget, too unsolved to move forward. For detectives, it was a haunting file that stared back from shelves, mocking them with fragments and silence. For the community, it was a reminder of vulnerability, that even in the safety of the mountains, horror could strike. For Tyran, it was a life paused, a young man who grew older each year without the anchor of family. And through it all, the same question echoed louder with every year: who had brought a wood chipper into the Cascades? And why? The answer, when it finally stirred, would be more disturbing than anyone imagined. The Thompson case was never formally closed, but by the mid-1990s it might as well have been. Files sat on shelves, growing dusty. Detectives rotated, new priorities took over, and the once urgent search for answers turned into a quiet, background hum. For most people in Mount Vernon, the wood chipper murder was no longer front-page news. It was a story told in hushed tones at campfires, a reminder of how cruel the world could be, a warning to stay away from certain trails. But for one person, the case was never past tense. By the time Tyran reached his 30s, the boy who once waited by the window for his parents had become a man marked by loss. He carried the case like a scar. Every job interview, every relationship, every attempt to move forward came with the unspoken weight. My parents were murdered, and no one knows why. People tried to offer comfort, but their words rang hollow. Time heals all wounds, but time hadn't healed. Time had only sharpened the absence. At night, Tyran still found himself driving into the Cascades. Sometimes he'd pull off at a trailhead, sit in silence, and stare into the trees, listening, searching, wondering if the forest still held answers it refused to give. In 1997, more than a decade after the disappearance, a new sheriff took office in Skagit County. He ordered a review of all major cold cases. The Thompson file was pulled out once more. A new set of eyes meant new energy. Detectives re-interviewed old witnesses. They revisited the site where the chipper had been found. They combed through the evidence again. But frustration came quickly. No new leads, no suspects, nothing to explain why two ordinary people were erased so brutally. And always the same chilling hole in the puzzle. Patricia. Steven's fate had been confirmed, but Patricia remained a ghost. Forensic experts had combed every fragment pulled from the chipper, every scrap of bone, every hair. Nothing pointed conclusively to her. Did the killer take her elsewhere? Did she die in another way separate from her husband? Or, an even more haunting thought, had she been kept alive? Theories swirled, each more unsettling than the last. By the late 1990s, DNA science was no longer an experiment. It was revolutionizing criminal investigations. Old cases were being cracked open by technology that hadn't existed before. The Thompson evidence was sent to a state crime lab. Analysts ran DNA profiles on the bone fragments, the hair, the fabric. The results confirmed what was already known: Steven. But once again, nothing tied definitively to Patricia. For investigators, it was maddening. For Tyran, it was torment. He wanted closure. He got silence. The abandoned wood chipper, now locked away in an evidence yard, became a kind of symbol. Investigators who worked the case described it as a machine that held a secret it would never give up. Its rusting teeth were a reminder that the killer had planned something grotesque, something meant not just to destroy life, but to erase evidence. And yet, for all its horror, the chipper also left behind the only trace of the truth: Steven's bones. It was as if the killer's perfect crime had cracked open just slightly, enough to reveal the brutality, but not enough to reveal the face behind it. As the 2000s dawned, the Thompson case faded once again. Other crimes took priority. Detectives retired. New ones came in, unfamiliar with the weight of 1985. But for Tyran, the years didn't dull the wound. He carried it like a shadow, growing older but never freer. Friends described him as someone who lived half in the past. He worked steady jobs, but his evenings were spent reading crime reports, mapping theories, writing letters to anyone who might listen. He refused to let his parents be forgotten. Then, in 2005, 20 years after the disappearance, forest workers stumbled across something chilling. Not a machine this time, not equipment, bones, scattered beneath the soil of a remote clearing, not far from where the chipper had been found. Small, brittle, worn by time, forensic teams moved in. They sifted through the soil carefully, collecting every fragment. Tests would later confirm they were human, female, and though degraded, the DNA matched what little maternal material could be compared. It was Patricia. For the first time in 2 decades, Tyran was able to bury both his parents. The funeral was small, quiet, attended mostly by distant relatives and a few old neighbors. Many of those who had once searched for Steven and Patricia were gone now, moved away or passed on. But for Tyran, it was monumental. 2 graves, 2 headstones, at last no longer half an answer. Yet even as he stood by the graves, another truth pressed on him like a weight. Knowing where they were didn't explain why, and until that answer came, the wound could never close. The discovery of Patricia's remains reignited the case once more. Detectives now had confirmation. Both victims were dead. Both had died violently. Both had been concealed in the wilderness. It was no longer a disappearance. It was murder twice over. But the same old problem remained. No suspects. The chipper had given up what it could. The forest had yielded Patricia's bones. But the killer's identity remained buried in silence. By now, the Thompson case had passed from news story to legend, from active search to enduring mystery. True crime writers speculated endlessly. Online forums dissected every detail. Was it a random drifter? A local? A criminal cover-up? Or something darker, more personal? Each theory had its believers. None had proof. And for Tyran, living through it all, it wasn't speculation. It wasn't entertainment. It was the story of his life. A life defined by a question mark. But silence, as investigators knew, is never truly empty. Sometimes silence means someone is still out there. And the next act would reveal that the story was far from finished. By 2010, 25 years had passed since Steven and Patricia Thompson vanished into the Cascades. For most of Mount Vernon, the story was a shadow from another time. A chilling tale people told newcomers. Don't go camping in the wrong part of the mountains. That's where the chipper was found. But in police files, the case still existed. Still marked open. Still unsolved. And for Tyran, now in his 40s, the wound had not softened. If anything, it had hardened into a permanent ache. His life had become an uneasy balance. Part of him trying to live, another part chained to the forest that had taken his parents. But what neither he nor investigators knew was that the silence of the case was about to fracture. In 2011, Washington State launched a cold case initiative, pairing retired detectives with younger investigators trained in modern forensic science. Old files were re-examined, evidence retested. The Thompson file landed on the desk of Detective Karen Ellison. She was younger, sharp, known for her persistence. When she read the case summary, 2 vanished campers, a wood chipper, partial remains, decades of silence. She felt the same chill investigators had described in 1989. She made a decision. This case will not remain a ghost story. Ellison began with the physical evidence. The wood chipper, now rusted and degraded, but still intact. She had it scanned, tested, swabbed with far more advanced methods than the 80s had allowed. Forensic labs could now detect trace DNA invisible decades earlier. Bone fragments and fabric. Tiny pieces overlooked in earlier testing were re-examined. Mitochondrial DNA sequencing, once impossible, was now standard. The orange backpack. Once dismissed as circumstantial, it was swabbed again. Fibers, soil, even pollen samples were cataloged. It was painstaking, meticulous work. And for months, nothing surfaced. Until something did. In late 2012, results came back from the chipper swabs. Among the degraded metal, in crevices untouched for decades, a partial DNA profile was recovered. It wasn't Steven. It wasn't Patricia. It was someone else. A male profile. Faint, partial, but distinct enough to rule out contamination. Ellison had the sample uploaded into CODIS, the national DNA database. Weeks passed. Then months. Nothing. But in 2013, a report landed on her desk. A hit. The partial profile from the chipper matched familial DNA submitted years earlier in an unrelated felony case. Not a direct suspect, but a family link. The name tied to the DNA? Holloway. a family name with deep roots in Skagit County. Ellison dug into records. The Holloways were an old local family, known for running a small-scale logging and equipment business in the 1980s. One member in particular stood out, Richard "Rick" Holloway, contractor, familiar with heavy machinery, known to have owned and abruptly lost a wood chipper in the mid-80s. In 1985, Rick Holloway had been questioned briefly in the Thompson disappearance. He told deputies he was home the weekend Steven and Patricia vanished. With no evidence tying him to the case, the lead had gone nowhere. But now, decades later, his family's DNA was inside the very machine used in the murder. When detectives told Ty Ran about the Holloway lead, he felt a rush of emotions he couldn't name. Anger, relief, fear, a name. After decades of silence, he finally had a name. But it was also terrifying, because with a name came the possibility of learning the full, horrifying truth. And Ty Ran wasn't sure he was ready for that. Detective Ellison built her case. She pulled Holloway's work records, financial statements, and property deeds. She interviewed surviving family members. She pieced together his movements in 1985. Patterns emerged. Holloway had been logging near the same stretch of forest where the Thompsons vanished. He had access to the equipment. He had the knowledge. And he had a history of volatile temper, especially toward outsiders trespassing near his work sites. But the hardest question remained, why Steven and Patricia? By 2014, nearly 30 years after the disappearance, Ellison and her team were confident enough to confront Holloway directly. He was now an old man, living quietly in rural Washington. When detectives arrived at his home, he seemed unsurprised, almost resigned. Neighbors said later they saw him sit on his porch that night, staring into the dark, as if waiting for something he'd long known was coming. And what Holloway eventually confessed, and what investigators unearthed, would not only explain the Thompsons' fate, it would reveal a darkness far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. When detectives sat across from Richard "Rick" Holloway in 2014, they didn't know what to expect. Some killers deny until the end. Others lie, dodge, or twist their words into shadows. But Holloway was different. He was old now, worn down, a man who had carried something too heavy for too long. And when Detective Karen Ellison slid a photograph of the rusted wood chipper across the table, his eyes locked onto it and stayed there. For a long time, he didn't speak. The only sound was the quiet buzz of the overhead lights. Then, almost in a whisper, Holloway said, "That machine has followed me my whole life." Piece by piece, Holloway unraveled the truth investigators had chased for nearly 3 decades. In 1985, he had been running an illegal logging operation deep in the Cascades, cutting without permits, selling timber under the table. It was small-scale but risky. If caught, he faced fines, prison time, the loss of everything. On June 21st, Steven and Patricia Thompson set up camp less than a mile from one of his active sites. Holloway noticed their car, their tent, the smoke from their fire. At first, he thought nothing of it. Campers were common. But then he heard them talking, saw Steven walking with a map, realized Patricia had taken photos. Photos of his trucks. Photos of cut stumps marked for protection. Photos that could ruin him. Holloway panicked. He approached their camp after dark, claimed he tried to scare them off, told them they were trespassing. But Steven argued back, told him they'd report the illegal logging, that what he was doing was criminal. The argument escalated. Holloway admitted he lost control. He struck Steven with a heavy tool. Patricia screamed, and in the chaos she ran. He chased her. She didn't make it far. Holloway told detectives he hadn't planned the machine for this. It was at his site used for grinding up brush and scraps. But when he realized what he had done, 2 bodies, 2 witnesses, he decided the machine was the only way to erase them. His voice cracked when he described the sound. The way it didn't stop. The way the machine seemed to consume not just the bodies, but his own soul. He had scattered what remained in the forest, moved the chipper, abandoned it when the pressure grew too heavy, and for nearly 30 years he had lived with it. Every noise in the night, every unexpected knock on the door, every glance from a neighbor. All of it haunted him. Detectives pressed him. Why had Patricia's remains been found elsewhere? Why not with Steven's? Holloway explained, his voice low, that the machine had jammed. Part of Patricia's body remained intact. Panicked, he buried her in a shallow grave away from the site, terrified someone would find her before he could finish the job. When he returned days later, he couldn't locate the exact spot. The forest had swallowed it. He left her there, and for decades, he prayed she'd never be found. In 2015, Rick Holloway was charged with 2 counts of murder. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, locals, true crime enthusiasts, all hungry for the story that had haunted Skagit County for 30 years. But for Tyran, sitting in the front row, it wasn't about headlines. It wasn't about legend. It was about finally staring into the face of the man who had taken everything from him. When Holloway shuffled in, older now, frail, Tyran felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a cold, hollow rage. Because the truth had not given him his parents back. It had only confirmed the horror. Holloway pled guilty in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison. The judge called the crime calculated, cruel, and unforgettable. As the gavel fell, the courtroom exhaled. The case that had lived in shadows for 30 years had found its ending. Or so it seemed. For Mount Vernon, the closure was bittersweet. The Washington wood chipper mystery was no longer unsolved, but the truth was darker than many had wanted to believe. It hadn't been a stranger. It hadn't been a drifter. It had been a local man, a neighbor, someone people had shared meals and handshakes with. The horror wasn't in the woods. It was in their own community. After the trial, reporters swarmed Tyran, asked him how he felt, asked if he had closure, asked if he could forgive. He said little, just one sentence that was quoted in papers across the state. Closure is a word for doors, not for graves. Today, the story of Steven and Patricia Thompson is taught in criminology courses. It is remembered in Washington as one of the most disturbing cold cases ever solved. The wood chipper still sits in evidence storage, rusted, silent. A machine that once held the darkest secret of the Cascades. And for Tyran, life goes on. But not without shadows, not without scars, not without nights where he still drives into the forest, parks at the trailhead, and listens to the trees. Because even when justice is served, some mysteries never truly leave. 2 lives erased, 4 years of silence, 3 decades of questions, and at the center of it all, a machine meant for wood, turned into an instrument of horror. The Washington wood chipper mystery is solved. But the echo of that night still lingers. In the forest, in the town, and in the heart of a son who waited too long for answers. Closure came, but not without scars. If you want to uncover more stories like this, subscribe and stay with us for the next mystery.